Hey everyone, tonight we are heading into the desert. Not the romantic kind with golden sunsets and Bedouin campfires, but the real kind, the kind that is flat and silent, and so vast that a person can walk for days without finding water, and where the things that move at night have been moving at night for a very long time. We are talking about the ghoul. Before we settle in, go ahead and like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of content you enjoy, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, and what time it is, where you are. If you are from the Middle East or North Africa, I want to hear from you especially. Did someone in your family ever refuse to take a certain road after dark? Did a grandmother ever warn you about something in the desert that she would not fully explain? I'd love to hear your stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan. Let us ease into this one. You think you know what a ghoul is. You have seen the word in horror movies. You have a picture in your head already. Something pale and hunched. Something that crawls around graveyards at night. Something that digs up corpses and eats them in the dark between headstones. A carrion creature. A scavenger. Maybe it looks like a zombie. Maybe it looks like something between a skeleton and a person who gave up on both. Maybe it has blank white eyes and the general energy of something that peaked in a cemetery. Whatever it looks like, it lives among the dead. And it eats dead people. And it is basically a vulture that hired a publicist and got a graveyard. That image is wrong. Almost completely wrong. And the reason it is wrong is more interesting than the monster itself. Because the story of how the real ghoul became the fake ghoul is a story about what happens when one culture's living nightmare gets picked up by another culture, run through a bad translation, and handed off to Hollywood without anyone stopping to check the original paperwork. The real ghoul has been misrepresented so badly that if you showed the original Arabic version to a Hollywood executive, he would send it back with notes asking for more graveyard. The real ghoul does not live in a graveyard. The real ghoul lives in the desert. It hunts the living. It is, in its original form, primarily female. It shapeshifts. It appears to travelers as a beautiful woman on a lonely road, and by the time you realize what you are looking at, you have already made the mistake that gets you killed. And it has exactly one physical tell that it cannot hide, no matter what form it takes, one crack in every disguise it has ever worn across 3,000 years of Arabic folklore. And that tell is not glowing eyes or a rotten smell or any of the cinematic conveniences you might expect. It is the feet. More specifically, the hooves. A ghoul always has the hooves of a donkey. Always, beautiful woman in the moonlight. Old beggar on the road. Your own long-lost relative, emerging from the dark, with her arms open. The hooves are there. They are always there. Every witness who survived noted the feet first. Every piece of Arabic literature that describes an encounter with one describes the moment when the traveler looked down and understood that the situation had just changed entirely. That moment, that downward glance, that pause before the brain finishes processing what the eyes are reporting, is the thing the ghoul is counting on. Because looking down means you are no longer running, and the ghoul is very good at what happens next. That detail is 3,000 years old, and it has never changed. Hollywood missed it. The graveyard version missed it entirely. But we are going to get to the graveyard version, and who invented it, and why, because that part of the story is genuinely unbelievable in the most literal sense. Let's start at the beginning, which in this case is not medieval Arabia. It is older than that. The creature that became the ghoul did not originate with the Arabs. It originated in ancient Mesopotamia, in the mythology of the Akkadians, which means we are talking about roughly 2300 BCE, and a civilization that predated Islam by nearly 3,000 years. The Akkadians had a class of underworld demon, called the Ghoul. The Ghoul were not subtle about their purpose. They were agents of the underworld sent to drag the living down into death, faceless and relentless, and they appeared in one of the oldest mythological narratives we have on record, the story of Dumuzid and Inanna, where they pursue the vegetation god across the earth, before eventually catching him and hauling him below. The Ghoul do not bargain in this story, they do not negotiate, they are not there to be reasoned with. They are there because they were sent, and they will not leave without the thing they were sent for. In 2300 BCE, that was already considered one of the more unsettling premises anyone had thought of. Some ideas are genuinely ahead of their time. Scholar Ahmed al-Rawi, who has written the most detailed academic analysis of the ghoul's cultural evolution, makes the case that the Ghoul passed into Arabic folklore through direct contact between Bedouin traders and Akkadian civilization. The two groups were neighbors. Arab traders moved through Mesopotamia regularly. Stories move with trade, the same way diseases do. except stories do not require a host. They do not die in sunlight, and nobody has ever developed a vaccine for one. By the time pre-Islamic Arabic poetry began recording encounters with the ghoul, the creature had been evolving in the desert imagination for centuries, absorbing local geography and local fear, and local detail, until it had become something distinct from its ancestor, but recognizable in the ways that matter. What it had become was this: a shape-shifting female demon of the wilderness, born of Iblis, the Islamic figure of darkness, and therefore technically a member of the jinn. Not the gentle or neutral jinn of folklore, the kind that grant wishes or haunt houses with mild menace, and occasionally leave things in different places. The ghoul was classified as a diabolical jinn, which in the hierarchy of Arabic supernatural beings means it was not mischievous or unpredictable, it was malicious. Intentionally and specifically malicious. The word ghoul itself comes from the Arabic ghala, meaning to seize, or from an earlier root, meaning to kill. Most cultures named their monsters after what they looked like. The Arabs named theirs after what it does to you. One of these is a hobby, the other is a field guide. The Bedouin, who spent their lives moving through the desert, and depended on their ability to read the landscape and trust their instincts for survival, developed a body of practical knowledge about the ghoul, the same way they developed practical knowledge about everything else that could kill them in the desert. They documented its behaviors. They identified its tells. They established defenses. They mapped its preferred territories, which tended to cluster around the kinds of terrain where travelers were most vulnerable: crossroads with no settlement visible in any direction, dry riverbeds that offered shade during the day and cover at night, the stretches of road between cities where you might walk for an entire day without seeing another human being. And they recorded all of this in poetry. Because in pre-Islamic Arabic culture, poetry was how you preserved and transmitted critical information. The Bedouin did not have textbooks. They had poets. The poets encoded survival knowledge in verse, and performed it at fires and passed it to the next generation. It sounds inefficient until you realize the poems were peer-reviewed by whatever ate the people who got the details wrong. The practical defenses were also specific. Travel in groups after dark when possible. If traveling alone, keep a fire. Call out to any figure you see from a distance before approaching, because the ghoul does not like to be named loudly and directly, and a traveler who greets a figure by calling out what it is loses the advantage of surprise for the creature. Do not answer calls or voices that come from off the road at night. Regardless of how familiar the voice sounds, regardless of how urgently it seems to need you, the voice is the bait, the urgency is designed. Anything that needs your help badly enough to call to you from the dark at the side of a desert road at midnight can wait until morning, and if it cannot, that is important information about what it actually is. These were not superstitions. They were the distilled experience of a culture that moved through dangerous terrain at night for centuries and kept careful track of what worked. The poet Tabata Sharon, whose name translates as he who carried evil under his arm, which is either a warning or a resume, depending on who is reading it, wrote one of the earliest surviving accounts of a ghoul encounter. He described a nighttime confrontation in the desert, a creature that shifted forms multiple times during the encounter, each form designed to create a specific hesitation, and a battle that he won through speed and precision, and the discipline to stop at one blow. His account established several details that would persist across centuries of Arabic literature. The ghoul hunts alone. The ghoul prefers the form of a beautiful woman. The ghoul is found in isolated desert places far from any community, and the ghoul can be killed with a sword if you strike it cleanly on the first blow. Tabata Sharon survived to write the poem about it, which is its own form of argument. Plenty of poets wrote about things they did not survive, but those poems required someone else to finish them. The second blow is the part nobody explains until it is too late. If you strike a ghoul, and it falls, and you are so relieved that you survived that you raise the sword again to make absolutely certain, the second blow reverses the first, not weakens it, reverses it entirely. The ghoul that was dead is now alive again. It is now aware that you know how to kill it. It knows you already tried twice, and the element of surprise you were relying on has been fully spent. What you have done, through a completely reasonable impulse toward thoroughness, is create the worst possible version of the situation you were trying to resolve. You went in with a plan and an advantage, and you managed to end up with neither. There is a lesson in that about restraint, and the specific danger of the victory lap, which the Bedouin understood, and which most modern action movie protagonists have not quite gotten around to. The hero who empties the clip, reloads, empties it again, and then hits the monster one more time just to feel better about it, would not survive one afternoon in the Arabian desert. He would be the cautionary tale in someone else's poem. So what is the ghoul actually doing out there in the desert, besides waiting? The primary method is impersonation, and the ghoul is extraordinarily good at it. It appears as something a traveler would trust or approach without thinking. A beautiful woman standing on a lonely road at a distance that implies distress but not immediate threat. An old woman bent over a walking stick at the edge of the firelight. A long-lost relative standing in the dark with her arms open, and her face turned slightly, so you cannot quite see the expression until you are close enough that it no longer matters. The encounter accounts in Arabic literature share a consistent structure. The traveler is always alone. The traveler always sees a figure. Something is almost right about the figure, but not quite. A slight wrongness in the way it moves or holds itself, or occupies the space around it. The kind of wrongness that registers somewhere below conscious thought, and produces a feeling that experienced desert travelers described as the air going heavier. The traveler approaches anyway, because the pull of human recognition is strong, and the desert is lonely, and help genuinely does sometimes appear from unexpected directions. The ghoul understands this. It is, in the oldest accounts, described as patient in a way that implies extended observation. It has watched people make this exact calculation before. It knows how long the hesitation lasts and what breaks it. And then someone looks down at the feet. The hooves are the only thing the ghoul cannot change. Every form it takes, every disguise it constructs, the hooves remain. They are there under the robe, under the dress, pressing into the sand in a shape that does not match the rest of what you are seeing. This is why Arabic folklore around the ghoul is so consistently specific about foot placement and footwear, why travelers were advised to look at the ground before looking at the face, why the standard opening move in any ghoul encounter was to identify what the figure was standing on before making any other assessment. It is practical advice in the plainest possible sense. It is the kind of advice that survives, because the people who followed it survived, and the people who did not follow it were not around to write poetry about it afterward. The Bedouin oral tradition has a fairly reliable filter for which advice was working. Scholar Dwight Reynolds has documented the ghoul's role in a specific subset of Arabic folk tales, told primarily to young women, where the creature typically appears as a relational figure, an aunt, a cousin, a familiar face from the village, sometimes a woman the male protagonist has been searching for, across considerable distance and difficulty. The creature lures male characters to their deaths, using exactly that recognition, that hope, that willingness to believe the familiar face in the dark is actually the person it appears to be. In these accounts, the female relatives of the victim can always see through the disguise. The men cannot, or will not. The women warn them. The men survive if they listen, and are eaten if they do not. This pattern is so consistent across the tradition that Reynolds identifies it as structural rather than incidental, which means it is doing cultural work beyond simple horror. The ghoul story in this context is carrying a specific message about the consequences of ignoring the warnings of women who can see what you cannot. That lesson has been embedded in the tradition for over 1,000 years. The fact that it has needed repeating for over 1,000 years is a separate and much longer conversation that is not this video. The important thing is that the tradition noticed the pattern, encoded the lesson in the scariest possible narrative format, and kept repeating it in the hope that eventually the message would land. Optimistic, really. The ghoul is also listed in Arabic taxonomy as capable of taking the form of a hyena. This is not arbitrary. The hyena in the Arabian desert occupies a specific cultural position. It is the animal most associated with scavenging, with deception, and with movement that looks almost normal until you watch it long enough and realize the proportions are wrong in a way you cannot immediately name. A hyena walking away from you in the desert looks, from a distance, like a person stooping. From the front, in the right light, it looks like almost anything. Its call sounds enough like a person in distress that experienced trackers learned to treat the sound with extreme suspicion, because responding to it had a poor survival record. In 1667, when a hyena attacked a woman in Mecca, the locals identified it immediately as a ghoul, not because they confused an animal for a supernatural creature in a moment of panic, but because in their framework the distinction was not necessarily the important one. What mattered was the behavior. What mattered was the approach pattern. What mattered was what to do next. And the answer to that question was the same regardless of which category it officially fell into. Let us slow down for a moment and actually walk through what a ghoul encounter was supposed to feel like from the inside, because the Arabic accounts are specific enough to be worth sitting with. You are traveling alone. This is the first mistake, but not always an avoidable one. Desert routes had to be taken when they had to be taken, and waiting for company was not always an option. when the caravan had already left and the city gates closed at dusk. The road is empty. It has been empty for several hours. The sun has gone down, and the desert at night is a different place than the desert during the day. Colder than you expected, quieter than feels comfortable. The darkness broken only by stars so dense they look structural like a ceiling. Someone built rather than a sky you are under. Then you see her. She is standing at the side of the road at a distance, where you can make out the shape, but not the face. The posture suggests distress. The shape suggests a woman, young, alone on a road where there should not be anyone. Everything about the presentation is calibrated for this exact moment, for the specific calculation a lone traveler makes when they see what appears to be another human being alone at night in the desert. The ghoul has been doing this for a long time. It has had every opportunity to refine the approach. You stop. You look. Something registers as slightly wrong, but you cannot name it. Maybe the way she is standing, with a stillness that is a degree past natural stillness. Maybe the way the shadow falls around her in a way that does not quite track with the light available. Maybe just the fact that she is there at all, on this road, at this hour, which does not make sense. But then again, the desert is full of things that do not quite make sense, and you are cold and tired, and another person means company, and maybe safety. So you approach. She turns slightly as you get closer, just enough to acknowledge you without quite showing you her face. She speaks. The voice is soft, distressed, exactly the register of someone who has been alone out here longer than is safe. She needs directions, or she needs water, or she needs you to come just a little further from the road where she dropped something she cannot find without help. And then you look down. The accounts are consistent on what happens in this moment. Not screaming, not running. A specific silence, the kind that happens when the brain receives information it is not ready to process, and everything else stops while it finishes the calculation. The hooves are there, pressed into the sand. Donkey hooves below the hem of a dress, on a desert road, at night, connected to a woman who was asking for your help 30 seconds ago and has not moved since you stopped talking. The situation has been reclassified in about half a second. What you do next determines everything. The sword, if you have one blow, clean, no second swing, regardless of what your instincts tell you about making sure. Step back, turn, run. Do not look back to check that it worked. Do not stop. Do not be thorough. The people who were thorough are not in the record. Now let's talk about what the Quran actually says about all of this, because the answer is more complicated than most people expect, and considerably more interesting. The Quran does not mention the ghoul at all. This is notable because the Quran mentions jinn extensively, addresses Iblis across multiple surahs with real theological depth, and engages seriously with the full range of Arabic supernatural tradition in ways that show direct familiarity with the cultural landscape. The ghoul is simply absent from the text. The Hadith, which records the sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, is where the situation gets more complicated and more interesting. In some accounts, Muhammad dismisses the ghoul as non-existent, a holdover superstition from the pre-Islamic period that the new faith had rendered obsolete. In others, he provides specific guidance on how to banish one if encountered, which is a somewhat different stance than declaring it does not exist. His companion Abu Asid al-Sadeh suggests that ghouls existed before Islam, but that God had since revoked their operating permit, which is a very confident thing to say about a creature that Umar ibn al-Khattab personally stabbed on a road to Syria 2 decades later. Another companion, Umar ibn al-Khattab, reportedly encountered a ghoul on the road to Syria, struck it once with his sword, confirmed it was dead, sheathed the weapon, and continued walking. No second blow. One of the Prophet's closest companions, the man who would go on to become the second Caliph of Islam, encountered a ghoul on an ordinary desert road and handled it correctly on the first attempt. He understood the assignment completely, and he had the discipline not to ruin it by going back for the reassurance swing. This is recorded as a historical incident in the tradition. Nobody questioned it at the time. In 7th century Arabia, this was simply the kind of thing that could happen on a road to Syria, filed alongside sandstorms and bandits as one of the practical hazards of desert travel. The appropriate response was the same composure you would bring to any other hazard, which says something interesting about the composure of the people involved. The Abbasid geographer al-Qazwini offered a creation story in his 13th century cosmography that circulated widely through the medieval Islamic world. When the fallen jinn tried to eavesdrop on the conversations of heaven, God hurled meteors at them to drive them away. Some burned entirely in the atmosphere and were gone. Some fell into the sea and became crocodiles. The text offers this as a consequence. The crocodiles were not consulted, the ones that struck the ground became ghouls. This origin story is interesting for several reasons, not least of which is that it presents the ghoul not as something that was created with malicious purpose, but as the unintended result of a punishment that landed wrong. They were not designed to be what they are. They became it through a combination of ambition, catastrophic failure, and the specific misfortune of hitting the ground instead of the water. A creature born from the wreckage of overreach and divine consequence, existing in the desert as something that was originally headed somewhere else entirely. A 13th century geographer wrote a better monster origin story in one paragraph with no budget. Hollywood responded by making the same graveyard zombie movie 47 more times. By the time Islam spread across the Arabian Peninsula and the wider Middle East in the 7th century, the ghoul was already so deeply embedded in the cultural imagination that Islamic doctrine could not simply declare it non-existent and expect the declaration to hold. Peter Holt and Anne Catherine Lambton, writing in the Cambridge History of Islam, described the resulting situation as integration rather than replacement. The tradition absorbed the ghoul into its existing framework of diabolical jinn, rather than attempting to void it, with the result that the creature occupied a genuinely unusual theological space, pre-Islamic in origin, adopted into Islamic supernatural taxonomy, absent from the Quran, dismissed and simultaneously engaged with in the Hadith, killable by the Prophet's companions on ordinary roads to Syria, which implies a level of mundane frequency that is either reassuring, depending on how you feel about the swords of 7th century caliphs, or deeply not. The ghoul spent roughly 1,000 years in that ambiguity, appearing in Bedouin poetry, in urban folklore, in the Arabian Nights, in travelers' accounts from the desert roads between major cities, in the practical warnings passed from parent to child, about which routes to take after dark, and which to leave for whatever was already using them. It was a consistent presence in the cultural landscape, documented and described and worked into the practical knowledge of desert travel, with the same matter-of-fact seriousness as knowing how to find water and how to read the wind. Not mythological in the sense of being distanced or archaic. Present, immediate, something you might encounter on the road to Syria if you forgot to check the feet. And then, in the early 18th century, a French scholar named Antoine Galland sat down to translate the Arabian Nights for European audiences. He had never been to Arabia. He did not speak to Bedouin about what they knew from experience. He worked from manuscripts, and he made decisions, and some of those decisions were mistakes, and some of those mistakes were large enough that they are still circulating 300 years later as established facts. The ghoul that emerged from his translation was not the creature that had been living in Arabic poetry for 3,000 years. It was something shaped by a European audience's existing expectations about where monsters live and what they eat. Something stripped of the desert and the hooves and the one-blow rule and the female form and the social function and the theological ambiguity. Something simpler and less dangerous and easier to put in a graveyard and forget about. It bore approximately the same relationship to the original as a photocopy of a photocopy of a photograph, technically related, functionally different, missing most of the information that made the original worth looking at. That version is the one Hollywood inherited. That version is what ended up in every zombie movie you have ever seen, in every graveyard horror that borrowed the name without doing the research, in the cultural shorthand for a creature that digs up corpses and shambles around looking threatening. And that is where everything went wrong in a way that is still going wrong today. Antoine Galland was 58 years old when he published the first volume of his Arabian Nights translation in 1704, and by every reasonable measure, he was the most qualified person in Europe to do it. He had traveled to Istanbul and Syria. He had spent decades studying Arabic manuscripts. He had copied inscriptions off monuments in 3 countries. He was eventually appointed to the chair of Arabic at the Collège de France. If you had to pick one man in all of 18th century Europe to translate this tradition accurately, you would pick Galland. He still got the ghoul completely wrong, not out of carelessness, not out of malice. Galland was working from a 14th century Syrian manuscript that already had centuries of distance from the original Bedouin sources, and he was translating for a French audience in 1704 that had never been to the desert, did not know what the desert looked like at night, and had no frame of reference for the specific fear of a lone traveller on a road between cities with no light and no company. What they knew was Gothic horror. What they knew was graveyards. So Galland, who was also a pragmatist, gave them something they could picture. According to Ahmed al-Rawi's analysis, Galland introduced the grave-digging detail himself. He invented the character Amina, a woman who sneaks out at night to feast on corpses in a cemetery with ghoul companions. He added the graveyard because the graveyard was legible to his audience. A monster that hunts the living by impersonating their loved ones in a vast empty desert requires context, geography, and a willingness to imagine a landscape most of his readers had never seen and would never see. A monster that eats corpses in a cemetery requires nothing except a stomach. One of these took 3,000 years to develop. The other took an afternoon. Galland spent 40 years mastering Arabic, travelled to 3 countries, and was the single most qualified person in Europe to translate this tradition. He is remembered for the part he invented. Galland also had help misrepresenting it. The scholarly consensus documented by Al-Rawi is that Galland's ghoul was further shaped by his Syrian informant Hannah Diriab, a Maronite Christian storyteller who recounted tales from memory during Galland's Paris years. Diriab's versions were already distant from the Bedouin originals, then filtered through Galland's European framing and his audience's Gothic expectations. The original creature passed through 2 levels of cultural translation before it reached print. By the time it emerged, the desert was gone, the hooves were gone, the impersonation was gone, and what remained was a graveyard monster the original tradition would not have recognized as related to itself at all. The translation was an instant success. There are accounts of Galland being woken at night by crowds of young men gathered under his Paris window, begging him to read them another story. He was a 58-year-old academic who had spent his career in libraries and on archaeological sites. The mob outside his window was not there for 40 years of scholarship. They were there for the corpse-eating woman. Galland had accidentally discovered that Europeans would riot for a corpse-eating woman and do absolutely nothing for Arabic manuscript preservation. The 12 volumes were immediately retranslated into English, German, Dutch, Italian, Danish, Russian, Flemish, and Yiddish. By 1712 the English had their version. By 1719 the Dutch had theirs. Within 15 years of the first volume, the graveyard ghoul was installed across the entire European literary tradition, with no competing version available to challenge it. The Arabic sources were in Arabic, which almost none of Galland's readers could access. The Bedouin oral tradition was in the Arabian desert, which none of Galland's readers were visiting. The wrong version had no competition, and approximately 3,000 miles of geographic buffer protecting it from being corrected. The wrong ghoul travelled in every shipment. Edward William Lane, who produced a far more careful translation in 1838, noted in his preface that Galland had, and these are Lane's words, excessively perverted the work. Lane also noted that Galland's knowledge of Arab manners had led to errors of, again Lane's words, the grossest description. This was Lane's polite way of saying that Galland had looked at one of the oldest and most sophisticated supernatural traditions in the world and handed Europe a creature that mainly hangs around cemeteries. Lane's own documentation of Egyptian ghoul belief, drawn from years of fieldwork in the 1820s, looked nothing like Galland's version. It looked exactly like the Bedouin tradition. The desert setting, the female form, the hooves, the impersonation. Lane was looking at a living tradition that had been running continuously for thousands of years while European Gothic literature was busy citing the wrong source. Lane corrected the record in 1838. Galland's version went on to inspire Gothic literature, H.P. Lovecraft, George Romero, and a billion-dollar film genre. Lane's version won the accuracy contest and lost every other contest. What Lane's Egyptian fieldwork documented was something the European scholars had not been looking for. The ghoul was still operational, not as a literary reference, not as a relic of pre-Islamic superstition that educated people had moved past. The Egyptians Lane spoke to in the 1820s treated the ghoul the same way the Bedouin poets had treated it 1,000 years earlier, as something that required practical defensive knowledge and careful behavior on desert roads. Lane was a meticulous scholar. He documented what he found. What he found was that 300 miles of Mediterranean and 2 centuries of bad translation had not changed anything on the ground. None of this slowed the wrong version down. Gothic literature picked it up and ran. The graveyard ghoul showed up in English poetry, in penny dreadfuls, in the illustrated horror publications that Victorian audiences consumed with the same enthusiasm they claimed to find morally troubling. William Beckford used the word ghoul in his 1786 novel Vathek, the first appearance of the term in English literature. He was drawing on Galland. He was not drawing on the desert. By the time the 20th century arrived, the ghoul as a cemetery creature was so embedded in Western horror that going back to check the original Arabic sources would have required caring that the original existed, which nobody was particularly motivated to do. And then, in the summer of 1967, a 27-year-old filmmaker in Pittsburgh started shooting a horror movie on weekends. George Romero's budget was $114,000. The blood was Bosco chocolate syrup. The flesh consumed by the monsters was meat and offal donated by a butcher shop whose owner was an investor. The pitch meeting for Night of the Living Dead involved a filmmaker asking a butcher to donate offal in exchange for a share of profits from a low-budget horror film shooting on weekends in Pennsylvania. The butcher said yes. The butcher retired comfortably. One fire was started by accident when a crew member poured gasoline onto a prop that still had a hot ember in it and discovered the problem at a speed he had not planned for. The working title was Monster Flick, which became Night of Anubis, which became Night of the Flesh Eaters, which finally became Night of the Living Dead, after a distribution conflict with an existing film of similar name. Everything about the production, from the budget, to the chocolate syrup, to the accidental fire, suggested the film would be forgotten inside a year. The universe reserves that kind of setup for things that are about to change everything. Here is the detail that almost nobody knows. Romero never called his monsters zombies. Not once, not in the script, not in the dialogue, not in any interview during production. In Romero's own words, given years later, "I never called ours zombies. We thought of them as ghouls." The news anchor in the finished film calls them flesh-eating ghouls. The characters call them ghouls throughout. The word zombie does not appear in the film at all. The word zombie was applied retroactively by a French film critic writing in Cahiers du Cinéma, because Romero's creatures did not fit the existing zombie category. At the time, zombie referred specifically to the Haitian voodoo tradition, an enslaved, reanimated corpse under the control of a sorcerer, passive, obedient, someone else's weapon. Romero's ghouls were nothing like that. They were independent, hungry, ungovernable, and multiplying. The culture needed a word for them. A French film critic provided one. What he provided it at the expense of was the Haitian tradition, which had its own specific history and its own specific cultural weight entirely separate from the Arabic one. The Haitian zombie was an enslaved, reanimated body under the control of a sorcerer, a concept rooted in the specific trauma of Caribbean slavery and completely unrelated to desert predators with donkey hooves. Films like White Zombie in 1932 had established this definition clearly. The zombie had a master. The zombie did not choose. When the Cahiers du Cinéma critic applied the word zombie to Romero's independent, ungovernable, masterless ghouls, he was not just misidentifying what Romero had built. He was stripping two traditions simultaneously, the Arabic one that had already lost the word ghoul, and the Haitian one that now lost the word zombie to a Pennsylvania farmhouse. The Western horror genre borrowed from three separate traditions, attributed nothing accurately, and moved on. The Arabic tradition lost its monster's name. The Haitian tradition lost its monster's name. The Western horror genre collected both, used neither correctly, and has since released 47 sequels. The word ghoul, having been borrowed and stripped and repurposed, was left available for reassignment to the graveyard creature Galland had invented in 1704. The result is the situation we currently live in. The creature Romero built and explicitly called a ghoul became what the world now calls a zombie. The creature that Arabic tradition had called a ghoul for 3,000 years lost its name to a filmmaker in Pennsylvania who did not know what the name originally meant. A French orientalist started it. A Pittsburgh filmmaker accelerated it. A French film critic finished it. The Arabic tradition did not get a vote at any stage of this process. They were not invited to the meeting. The meeting was not held anywhere near the desert. What the Arabic tradition was left with was a name that now meant something else, and a creature that the cultures which had borrowed and renamed everything refused to look at directly. The shape-shifting female desert predator with 30 centuries of documented encounters and a specific testable kill method and a body of defensive knowledge built from actual field experience was now officially the wrong version. The graveyard creature with no hooves, no impersonation method, no one-blow kill rule, no theological history, and no social function was the version with the film deal. The library was still there. The poetry of Tabata Sharon was still there. Al-Suyuti's taxonomy was still there. None of it was being consulted. The researchers who eventually went back to it in the late 20th century found it exactly where it had been left, complete, detailed, and waiting for someone to actually read it. Now let us talk about what the Arabic and Islamic scholarly tradition had been building during all those centuries, while the wrong version was being distributed across Europe. The Abbasid scholar, Al-Jahiz, writing in the 9th century, documented ghoul behavior with the same methodical precision he applied to his natural history writing, which is to say, he treated it as a subject requiring careful observation rather than creative embellishment. He noted the preference for crossroads and isolated terrain. He noted the female form as primary and consistent. He noted the fire-lighting behavior, the ghoul positioning itself at a distance and lighting a small fire, creating the appearance of a fellow traveller's encampment. He noted that the fire was not comfort. The fire was bait. Al-Jahiz was writing field notes. He had the tone of someone who expected his readers to encounter the subject professionally. The medieval Arabian Nights, before Galland processed it, contained ghoul encounters that were procedural and specific in ways the Western adaptations never preserved. In the tale of Sidi Numan, a man follows his wife through Baghdad at night, watches her enter a graveyard, and observes her eating a freshly buried corpse with a companion. When he confronts her, she does not deny it. She explains the logic of her existence, in terms that the account treats as internally coherent. She is not chaos. She is a different operational framework running alongside the human one, with its own requirements and its own economy. Galland kept the graveyard scene and stripped the framework. The result was a monster that ate corpses for no particular reason. The original had a monster that ate corpses for very specific reasons, which is considerably more interesting and considerably more difficult to dismiss. The 15th century scholar Al-Suyuti compiled the standard taxonomic reference for ghoul behavior that Islamic scholars used for several hundred years afterward. His classification identified 3 operational modes. The first was the desert predator mode, the oldest and most documented, involving isolation, impersonation, and the hooves that could never be fully concealed. The second was the urban mode, in which the ghoul infiltrated a settlement under a sustained human disguise and operated there for months or years before being identified. Urban ghoul accounts exist across the Islamic world, in Egypt, in Persia, in the Levant, and they share a consistent structure. The community eventually becomes aware, the awareness builds slowly, and the evidence is behavioral rather than supernatural. The third was what Al-Suyuti called the threshold mode, the ghoul positioned at the exact boundary between the inhabited and the uninhabited, the last lamp before the road became desert, the edge of the village where the light stopped, waiting for whoever crossed in the wrong direction at the wrong hour. The urban mode raises questions the desert predator mode does not. If a ghoul can sustain a human disguise indefinitely, then checking the feet on a desert road is not the whole answer. The detection problem becomes entirely different, and Al-Suyuti's detection criteria for the urban ghoul are not about supernatural tells at all, they are behavioral. The creature accumulates food beyond any normal need. It is drawn to illness and death in ways that exceed what grief or professional obligation would explain. Its absence at night is consistent and unexplained. It shows no genuine distress in situations where distress would be the natural human response. These are observable things. A patient community paying attention over time could track all of them without any special equipment or supernatural perception. The tradition was not describing a problem that required magic to solve. It was describing a problem that required patience and the willingness to trust what you were seeing over what you were being told. Medieval scholars were apparently more comfortable with that distinction than we tend to credit them for. The threshold mode, in particular, generated a body of account literature that reads more like incident reports than folklore. Travelers documented the experience of approaching a settlement boundary at dusk and seeing a figure standing exactly at the point where the road became desert. The figure always appeared to be doing something ordinary. It never spoke first. It waited. The accounts that ended badly were the ones where the traveler spoke first, because speaking first meant closing the distance before checking the feet, and closing the distance before checking the feet meant the relevant mistake had already been made. Al-Suyuti noted that the threshold mode was the most dangerous operationally because it exploited the specific moment of transition. A traveler arriving at the edge of a settlement was exhausted, relieved, focused on what lay ahead, in exactly the mental state where the brain shortcuts pattern recognition and processes familiar shapes as the safe thing they usually represent. The ghoul understood this, the same way a predator understands a watering hole, not through some special malevolent intelligence, but through 3,000 years of watching where the hesitation happens. The defensive knowledge in the rural tradition was equally specific. Salt at the threshold, the adhan, the call to prayer, recited at full volume to drive a ghoul from an encampment, iron that had been touched by fire at doorways, These defenses appear consistently across independent sources from different regions and different centuries, which is either evidence of a genuinely unified tradition transmitting specific tested information, or evidence of something worth taking seriously, being observed and documented across a very wide area for a very long time. The modern Arab world has not set the question aside. In the Gulf states, encounter accounts are still documented. They appear in regional newspapers. They are discussed in religious contexts on their own terms, without the embarrassed framing that Western coverage would reflexively apply. In 2009, a Saudi newspaper reported a ghoul encounter near a desert highway that generated serious official comment, taken seriously as a report rather than as a story about folklore. The accounts from these modern reports follow the pattern of the oldest sources with a consistency that researchers have found difficult to explain as simple cultural transmission. They cluster around desert roads. They involve isolated travelers. The creature is consistently female in the original contact. The modern versions add details the medieval sources could not have anticipated. A figure pacing a car at highway speed. Something in the headlights that is gone when the car stops. A voice from outside that sounds exactly like someone who is not there. The desert has not changed. The roads are paved now. The travelers have headlights and GPS. But whatever is being described has been working these roads since before the asphalt existed, and it has had considerably longer to study how people decide whether to stop than any individual driver has been alive to make that decision. Meanwhile, in the Western tradition, the graveyard version was having a fine career. H.P. Lovecraft built an entire subterranean civilization of ghouls in his fiction. His ghouls are canine, degenerate, live in tunnels beneath cemeteries, and eat corpses. Lovecraft read obsessively, documented his research meticulously, and corresponded with scholars about the sources for his fictional mythology. He simply did not read the Arabic sources. The Arabic sources contained a shape-shifting desert predator with a 3,000-year kill record and a theological history argued over by the prophet's own companions. Lovecraft built dog people who live in holes. This is what happens when you do the research, but skip the bibliography. Tabletop role-playing games eventually assigned the ghoul a challenge rating, a number, expressing how difficult it is to defeat in competitive gameplay. The challenge rating of the original tradition's ghoul, which required a single sword blow executed with perfect restraint, or you would personally undo the only advantage you had, was not a number, it was a poem. The poem was written by a man named Tabata Sharon, who survived the encounter and went home and wrote it down. The challenge rating system does not have a category for that. Let us slow down and walk through what a confrontation with the real ghoul actually looked like in the accounts that survived, because the medieval Arabic sources are specific enough to be worth sitting with properly. You are traveling the road between cities at night. It is night because you misjudged the distance, or because the caravan left without you, or because the business in the last town took longer than expected. There is no light except stars. The desert on both sides of the road is absolutely flat, which means nothing can hide from you, which should be reassuring, and is not. You see a figure ahead, female, standing at the side of the road, in a way that suggests waiting or distress, close enough to resolve a shape, not close enough to resolve a face. The accounts agree on what happens next in the body before the mind catches up. A specific cooling in the chest, a sharpening of the vision, a weight on the back of the neck. The experienced desert travelers described this as the air going heavier. The accounts from people who survived mention it. The accounts from people who did not survive are not available. You stop. You assess. The figure has not moved. This is either very good or very bad, depending on which thing it is. Now the tradition gives you exactly one useful action. Look down before you look at the face. Look at what the figure is standing on. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The pull toward the face, toward recognition, toward the question of whether this is a person who needs help, is extremely strong. It is the pull the ghoul is relying on. If the feet are human, approach normally. If the feet are hooves, the situation has been reclassified entirely, and you have approximately the time it takes to draw a sword. One blow, clean, no second swing. The accounts that end well are very short at this point. The traveller struck once, turned, and left. There is nothing else to report. The accounts that end badly are longer, and they get longer exactly at the moment the traveller raised the sword a second time. The Bedouin tradition is full of instructional narratives structured this way. Short accounts of people who did the right thing, long accounts of people who did not. The differential in length is the lesson. Let us put numbers to this for a moment, because the scale of the misrepresentation is worth sitting with. The Arabic Ghoul tradition, at the point Galen translated it in 1704, had been documented continuously for approximately 3,000 years. It had survived the transition from pre-Islamic to Islamic theology, been absorbed into Islamic supernatural taxonomy without losing its essential character, and been documented by scholars in multiple languages, with consistent behavioral detail across different centuries and regions. What Galen translated was not that tradition. He translated a 14th century Syrian manuscript, one recension among many, already several steps removed from the Bedouin sources, and added graveyard elements that appear in no Arabic source before his version. The Edward Lane correction of 1838 documented the real tradition accurately. It was read by scholars. It did not become the version anyone used. The H.P. Lovecraft version, published between 1926 and 1937, had the creature living in underground tunnels with canine features and no connection to Arabia. It became foundational to 20th century horror. The George Romero version from 1968 was explicitly named Ghoul by its creator, had nothing to do with the desert or shapeshifting or hooves, was retroactively renamed Zombie by a French film critic, and became the defining monster of a genre worth billions of dollars. The tabletop role-playing game version from the 1970s assigned the Ghoul a challenge rating of 1, meaning it was a minor enemy appropriate for beginning adventurers who had just started and needed something easy to fight. In the original tradition, the only recorded defense required a single sword blow of perfect execution, and the restraint not to follow it with a second, and the scholars who documented encounters treated it as a threat, serious enough to warrant its own taxonomic category below. Only the most powerful class of supernatural beings in the entire Islamic hierarchy. Challenge rating 1. The same category as a giant rat. Umar ibn al-Khattab, the future second caliph of Islam, killed one on a road to Syria, and it was considered significant enough to record in religious history. The Dungeons & Dragons design team gave it the same difficulty as a large rodent. Someone got that very wrong, and it was not Umar. The graveyard version is at least consistent. It lives in one place. It does one thing. It is not going to study you from a distance long enough to know which voice will make you open the door. It is not going to stand at the edge of your firelight, wearing a face you recognize with hooves, pressed into the sand that you will not think to look for until you are already close enough that looking no longer helps. The real Ghoul is none of those things. The real Ghoul learned how people decide whether to trust what they see before the cities those people live in existed. It is still learning. So here is where we are. The Ghoul has been hunted in the Arabian desert since before the Arabic language existed in its current form. It has been documented by poets, by scholars, by the Prophet's own companions, by geographers, by natural historians, by travelers who came back, and by travelers who did not. It has survived 3,000 years of theological debate, 2 major cultural translations, 1 very confident French orientalist, 1 Pittsburgh filmmaker, and a tabletop game that gave it the same difficulty rating as a large rat. And it is still here. The question that the Arabic tradition eventually settled on was not whether the Ghoul exists. That question was considered answered. The question was how to live in a world where it does. How to travel the desert roads after dark. How to identify what is standing at the edge of the firelight before you get close enough that identifying it stops being useful. How to strike once and stop. How to build a community that can recognize the long behavioral signature of something that has learned to pass as human. These are practical questions. The tradition answered them practically. The Arabic word for this community knowledge is not mythology and not superstition. The scholars who compiled it used the same word they used for practical medicine and astronomy and navigation, ilm, knowledge. The kind tested against outcomes and revised when outcomes do not match. The communities that lived on the desert trade routes for 30 centuries were not sentimental about which knowledge they passed down. They passed down what kept people alive. The Ghoul tradition survived because it was in that category. The answers have been sitting in Arabic manuscripts for 1,000 years, while the Western tradition was busy putting the wrong version in penny dreadfuls, and they are detailed answers, not vague cultural wisdom about being careful in the dark. Specific, procedural, field-tested knowledge about what the Ghoul does first, what it does second, what it is trying to accomplish at each stage of the approach, and what specific intervention disrupts each stage. The Bedouin tradition produced this knowledge the same way it produced knowledge about finding water in the desert or reading wind patterns for navigation, carefully, from experience, with a strong preference for information that kept the person who used it alive. Now let us talk about what the Ghoul is actually doing when it takes human form. because the Arabic tradition is more specific about this than most people realize, and the specificity is what makes it genuinely unsettling in a way the graveyard version never managed. The ghoul does not just wear a human shape, it studies a specific human. It watches from a distance, sometimes for days, learning the details that make a person recognizable to the people who know them. The gait, the posture, the specific way someone holds their hands when they are tired. The voice, which is the most important element, and the one the tradition warns about most consistently. The voice is how the ghoul closes the distance. The hadith accounts are specific about this. A lone traveler hears his name called from a direction that does not make sense. The voice belongs to someone he knows. The instinct is to respond, and the tradition is equally specific about what happens to the people who do. The ones who answer are the ones whose accounts end early. The ones who call back with a question the real person would know, who wait for a response that never comes correctly, are the ones who write the poems afterward. The voice mimicry is not just any familiar voice. It is the specific register the target responds to. Not your name as a stranger would say it. Your name as your mother says it when she is worried. Your name as your closest friend says it when something is wrong. The version that bypasses the part of your brain that asks questions and goes directly to the part that moves your feet. The tradition's defense is precise. Never respond directly to a voice calling your name from an unexpected direction at night. Call back with a question. Make the voice prove itself. Ask something only the real person would know. The ghoul can produce the voice. The ghoul cannot always produce the answer. Because the answer requires knowledge the ghoul has not yet had time to acquire. The word yet is doing a lot of work in that sentence. There is a medieval Arabic story, documented by Al-Jawzi, in his compilation of cautionary accounts, about a man from the Iraqi city of Kufa, who kept hearing reports of a ghoul on the outskirts of the city. He was skeptical. He decided to investigate personally, which is exactly the kind of initiative that the ghoul tradition has a specific outcome category for. He rode out at night. He encountered what appeared to be a fiery creature expanding and contracting in size, moving erratically in the dark. His horse panicked and threw him. He followed the creature on foot into a series of narrow corridors and eventually caught it. It was a woman, a slave from a family in Kufa, who had discovered that travelers threw their luggage and ran if they believed they were seeing something supernatural. She had been using a stick, a piece of cloth, and a candle to create the illusion of a shifting, glowing entity for long enough that she had accumulated a significant collection of abandoned goods. She was not a ghoul, she was hungry, and she had noticed that fear is easier to manufacture than food. The Arabic tradition kept this story, not as proof that ghouls do not exist, but as a reminder that not everything on a desert road at night is what it appears to be, which is actually the same warning the ghoul tradition had been delivering from the beginning, just with a different creature at the end of it. The lesson survived the plot twist completely intact. Whether the thing in the dark is supernatural or just desperate, you still check the feet before you get close. The advice does not change. Only the explanation does. Al-Jahiz, the 9th century scholar, who was also the most prominent rational skeptic in the classical Islamic tradition, argued that ghoul sightings could be explained by the psychology of solitary desert travel. A person alone in the dark, in an environment where everything can kill them, in a culture that has told them since childhood what to expect on a dark road, will find what they are looking for. The fear shapes the perception becomes the account becomes the tradition. This is a reasonable argument. Al-Jahiz was a genuinely brilliant man, whose work on rhetoric, zoology and theology is still read by scholars. He was also the same man who, in the same texts where he debunks ghoul accounts, wrote the most detailed behavioral description of the ghoul available from the 9th century. He documented its firelighting technique. He documented its preference for crossroads. He documented the voice mimicry in careful detail. Then he explained why none of it was real. Al-Jahiz spent 40 years documenting a creature he officially did not believe in. He did not find this ironic. The Mutazilite school of Islamic theology, the rationalist faction, officially denied the existence of ghouls on theological and empirical grounds. Their denial was noted, recorded with considerable respect for their reasoning, and did not change anything about what people encountered on desert roads. The thing they were officially denying had no particular interest in whether it was officially recognized. This pattern has repeated itself often enough across the history of the ghoul, that it is almost its own tradition at this point. The Mutazilites denied it in the 9th century, European Enlightenment scholars dismissed it in the 18th. Western anthropologists classified it as folklore in the 19th. The communities on the desert roads between those centuries continued checking the feet of figures at the edge of their firelight, because their framework for evaluating evidence was weighted toward outcomes rather than institutional consensus. The institutional consensus issued a formal denial and went back to their books. The people on the desert roads checked the feet and went back to their families. Now let us talk about what the tradition says to do when the defensive knowledge has already failed. The tradition has 3 defenses. None of them are what you would expect from a culture that spent 3,000 years being frightened by something. The first is the sword. One blow, clean. No second swing regardless of what your instincts are screaming at you. This requires proximity, nerve, and a specific discipline that is considerably harder than it sounds when your hands are shaking, and the thing just fell, and the part of your brain demanding you make sure is louder than any instruction you memorized in daylight. The Bedouin tradition produced this rule, and trusted that the people who needed it could follow it. That trust was not always well placed. The accounts of people who followed it are the ones where the person came home. The accounts of people who did not follow it are the longer ones. There is a reason the tradition is so specific about this failure point. The instinct to strike twice is not cowardice or stupidity. It is a completely reasonable response to surviving something that was trying to kill you. You are shaking. Your heart is moving faster than it was designed to sustain. The thing is on the ground. The impulse to make sure is not a character flaw. It is the brain running its standard threat resolution protocol. The ghoul is not counting on you being stupid. It is counting on you being human. It built this specific vulnerability into its kill method somewhere around 2300 BCE, and it has been collecting on it ever since. The second is the adhan. The call to prayer, recited at full volume, drives the ghoul from an encampment. This defense appears across sources with no apparent connection to each other, documented in Egypt, in Persia, in the Levant, in the Arabian Peninsula, consistently and without variation. This is either a unified oral tradition transmitting with unusual fidelity, or independent field testing producing consistent results across a very wide area. The tradition kept it because it worked. The tradition was not in the business of keeping things that did not work. The survival rate was too direct a measure. The third defense is naming. Not using the word ghoul as a general category. Naming the specific entity directly out loud, from a position of certainty rather than fear. The tradition holds that the ghoul's entire operational approach depends on the uncertainty it creates. The hesitation before you look down. The moment where the brain is still negotiating between the face you recognize and the thing you know you should be checking for. Remove that uncertainty, and something structural in the ghoul's approach collapses with it. But the naming only works when the person doing it has completely resolved the hesitation, has looked down, has confirmed the hooves, has accepted, without any remaining negotiation, what they are looking at. A name spoken from fear is not the same thing as a name spoken from knowledge. The ghoul knows the difference. It has been listening to people name things in fear for 3,000 years. Fear in the voice means the hesitation is still available. The hesitation is the only opening the ghoul ever needed. This mirrors almost exactly what the Navajo tradition says about the skinwalker. Name it, and it loses power. The silence that both traditions insist on is not cultural sensitivity or superstition. It is a functional defense. You do not say the name casually, in the wrong place, to the wrong people. Because casual naming is not the naming that protects you. Casual naming is just announcing yourself on a road where something is listening for exactly that frequency. There is one more detail about the ghoul's method that the tradition records carefully, and the graveyard version never thought to inherit. The ghoul takes the form of the person it most recently ate, not a convenient random disguise. The specific face of the specific person who is now gone, which means the ghoul approaching your encampment wearing your traveling companion's features, may be wearing them because your traveling companion has already been eaten. And the thing that is using his face now knows everything he knew about you, including your name in the register that bypasses your questions and moves your feet without asking permission. The tradition treats this as operational information, not horror embellishment. If someone you were traveling with disappeared, and you cannot account for where they went, and then a person appears claiming to be them, that person deserves a very specific scrutiny before you let them back into the firelight. The feet, every time, regardless of the face. No exceptions for people you recognize, because recognition is exactly what the ghoul is selling, and it has had a very long time to practice the sales pitch. The ghoul understands patience in a way that makes most human defensive strategies look rushed. It has been doing this since before the cities you live in were built. It was hunting travelers on the roads between Mesopotamian city-states, when those city-states were the most advanced civilization on Earth. It watched the Akkadian Empire rise and fall. It watched the pre-Islamic Arab poets document it in verse. It watched Islam absorb it into a new theological framework without erasing it. It watched Antoine Galland sit down in Paris in 1704 and invent a different creature using its name, and it watched the wrong version spread across Europe, while the real version stayed in the desert waiting for someone to eventually come back and check the original paperwork. Nobody checked the paperwork for 300 years. The ghoul is patient enough that 300 years is not a particularly long wait. When researchers finally went back to the Arabic sources in the late 20th century, what they found was a tradition that had not degraded. The core behavioral documentation was consistent from the pre-Islamic poetry through the 9th century scholars, through the 15th century taxonomies, through the modern Gulf accounts. The hooves, the voice, the one-blow rule, the fire used as bait, the preference for crossroads and thresholds, the behavioral signature of the urban infiltrator. All of it there, all of it coherent, all of it waiting to be read by anyone who knew Arabic and had a reason to look. The tradition did not need to be rescued. It had been maintaining itself without outside assistance for 3,000 years. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was waiting to see if anyone would eventually show up and do the reading. Let us also talk about the specific kind of patience the ghoul operates on, because it is not the patience of something waiting for an opportunity. It is the patience of something that has already studied you. The urban ghoul accounts al-Suruti documented appear across the Islamic world in Egypt, in Persia, in the Levant, and in the Arabian Peninsula. They describe something that infiltrates communities and remains there for extended periods, months, sometimes years, long enough to learn the rhythms of daily life in the specific settlement, long enough to know which family has been expecting a relative to return, long enough to know which traveler is due back from which road, and roughly when, long enough to show up wearing that traveler's face at the right time, from the right direction, with the right details already in place. The tradition produced these accounts not to make people paranoid about their neighbors, but because the behavioral signature of the urban infiltrator is observable over time. If you are paying attention, the communities that paid attention caught them. The ones that did not have a different kind of story. Al-Suyuti's behavioral signature is not supernatural. It is observable. The creature accumulates food beyond any normal need, because it cannot sustain itself on what normal people eat for any extended period. It is drawn to illness and death with a consistency that exceeds what professional obligation or grief would explain. It is absent at night with a regularity. The community eventually notices if someone is tracking it. It shows no genuine distress in situations where distress would be the automatic human response, because distress requires an investment in the outcome that the ghoul does not have. These are all things a community watching carefully over time can see. The tradition was not asking for supernatural perception. It was asking people to trust what they observed over what they were being told. That is not a difficult ask. It is just an uncomfortable one, because what you are observing is wearing the face of someone you thought you knew. The title of this video is that the ghoul is the most misrepresented monster in the history of horror, and at this point you have everything you need to evaluate that claim yourself. The graveyard version is consistent. It shows up in the same place every time. It does the same thing. It requires no special knowledge to identify. It has been generating reliable mediocre horror since 1704. It got the name, the film deals, the tabletop ratings, the cultural real estate, the franchise. It has been wrong about everything since Galland invented it on a Tuesday afternoon in Paris, and it has been wrong loudly and profitably and at industrial scale for 300 years. Being wrong has not slowed it down even slightly. Being wrong has, if anything, been the source of its commercial appeal. The correct version requires 3,000 years of Arabic scholarship. The wrong version requires a graveyard and a man named Antoine. Hollywood chose the version that required less reading. The real ghoul got none of that. It got its name taken, its behavioral record ignored, its theological complexity flattened into a cemetery decoration, its actual kill method, which requires a precision and restraint that most action heroes in the zombie genre would fail on the first swing, quietly discarded in favor of nothing in particular. What the real ghoul got instead was 3,000 years of being right. 3,000 years of accounts that hold together across languages and centuries and cultures without anyone coordinating the story. 3,000 years of consistent behavioral documentation from people who had every practical reason to be accurate because the alternative was not being alive to revise their notes. 3,000 years of a tradition that built its knowledge from field experience. tested it against outcomes, and passed it down in poetry, because poetry was what survived when everything else burned. 3,000 years of being the most thoroughly documented, most specifically described, most operationally detailed supernatural creature in the history of human folklore, and the Western horror tradition responded by calling it a challenge rating 1 undead, and moved on. 3,000 years of documented kills, and the West gave it the same difficulty rating as a house cat with aggression issues. The graveyard version will shamble toward you in a straight line in full view with plenty of warning. The real ghoul has already been watching you for 3 days. It knows your mother's voice. It knows which name you respond to when you are half asleep. It knows you are going to look at the face before you look at the feet, because it has watched 1,000 people make that calculation in exactly that order, and it has learned, across 3,000 years of watching, exactly how long the hesitation lasts before you move. It is standing at the edge of the light right now wearing a face you recognize, and you have not looked down yet. If this video kept you company tonight, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you are from and what time it is there. If you grew up in the Middle East or North Africa with a different version of this story, I want to hear it in the comments. Sleep well, check the feet before you check the face.